Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program. We have a special program for you tonight with Dan Schnur. It's a special midterm edition report, Solutions, Not Bickering, a Smarter Conversation about Politics. For those of you who would like to ask questions of Dan, please submit your questions in the Q&A portion at the bottom of the screen. Rachel Kennardine, our community manager, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about a half hour to 35 minutes. Dan, it's time for me to bring you on because our audience is chomping at the bit to talk to you about these midterms.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
I can't wait to hear your program tonight. We have so much to learn. So Dan, take it away.
Okay. Wow. Okay, well, there is a lot to cover on the election. No question about it. But as always, I want to thank all of you for joining us for tonight's program. As always, it's really fun for me to be able to talk about these things with a smart group like all of you. And as Kim said, I too am very excited that after moving to a monthly schedule at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2022, the fact that we're adding a couple of extra webinars, one this month and then a second one in November also, to talk through these races in more detail is especially interesting and exciting to me. Before we get started, though, I have one piece of non-campaign related business, and I hope you'll indulge me on this. Today is October 25th, which is my father, Bob Schnur of Verona, Wisconsin. It is my father's 84th birthday, and my dad watches these webinars on a regular basis, as good parents should, of course, and he's probably a little bit upset with me right now for calling him out like this, but he's an amazing man. He's still the smartest man I've ever met, and if there's anything that all of you get from our conversations every month, a lot of it comes from what I learned from him over the years. So happy birthday, Dad. Okay, now let's get to work. So now, though, before we dig into the campaign discussion, and there's plenty to discuss, there are two important issues off the campaign trail that I want to raise for just a moment. Because for most of the year, we try to balance, as all of you know, between politics and policy. Campaigns, elections are very interesting, very exciting, and very important. But of course, elections have consequences. And the outcomes that arise from the results of these campaigns have enormous impact on all of our lives. And there's a couple of issues that aren't getting much discussion in the campaign dialogue that I do want to bring up just briefly before we head to the campaign trail. The first, of course, is Ukraine. And even though a relatively small number of candidates in both parties are talking about the war in Ukraine, of course, it continues to rage. But what I want to talk about tonight is not so much the war itself. We'll have more of a chance to talk about that after the election, of course. But I want to talk about what's going on in this country as it relates to the Americans' feelings about our country's continued involvement in Ukraine's war with Russia. In the last week, just in the last several days, both parties have taken some very interesting and some very important steps and made some very important statements as it relates to Ukraine. And both of those statements suggest that the base of both parties, the most conservative of Republicans and the most liberal of Democrats, are starting to get a little bit antsy about the US involvement over there. So last week, Republicans came first. House Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, who hopes to become House Speaker, of course, after next month's elections, warned against the United States giving a quote unquote blank check in support of Ukraine's continued military efforts to defend themselves against Russia. McCarthy made it clear that he was not suggesting that we cut off all aid to Ukraine, but suggested that there were many members of his caucus who were not nearly as enthusiastic as they might have been earlier in the year about us continuing to provide that support. Now, more traditional Republicans, Mitch McConnell over in the Senate, Mike Pence, the former vice president, and a number of others, reaffirmed both the countries and their parties' commitment to Ukraine, but it did suggest a certain uneasiness among conservative Republicans about continuing to be engaged in that space. And then, just in the last couple of days, the Democrats followed suit. The Democratic Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives yesterday sent a letter to President Biden urging somewhat of a change of course in Ukraine, with a much greater emphasis on diplomacy and possibly coming to some type of compromise with Russia in order to end the violence. This led to all sorts of consternation, both within the Democratic Party and without. And today, for those of you who didn't see the news, the Democratic Progressive Caucus withdrew the letter that they had sent to the president just yesterday. So from the very beginning, we've talked about this in webinars quite a bit over the course of 2022. From the very beginning, Vladimir Putin was gambling that the United States and other Western countries at a certain point would lose their enthusiasm for this war. And whether it was because of inflation, whether it was because of oil prices, whether it was because of other types of expenditures, at a certain point, Western support for Ukraine would begin to dissipate. Now, overall, public opinion polls show that the American public still is very much strongly in favor of us continuing to support Ukraine financially and lending them military assistance. But what we've seen in the last week is the basis of both parties. Again, the most conservative of Republicans, the most liberal of Democrats, beginning to voice their unease. And once this starts, we've learned from experience, it generally doesn't reverse itself. So first question, not on the campaign trail, but on this very important question of the U.S. relationship with Ukraine. Katie, if we can put up our first question for our group. Question for all of you. How do you think the U.S. should proceed in Ukraine? Option one, we should keep supporting Ukraine with weapons, but not with direct U.S. troop involvement, basically continuing as is. Second option, we should increase our involvement there, either greater financial support or possible direct military support. Third, we should focus more on a diplomatic solution rather than military support. Fourth, we should reduce funding for Ukraine, but maintain some support. And fifth and finally, we should end our involvement in Ukraine. Once again, lots of changes going on with the American electorate over the course of the summer and fall. Katie, let's see what our group had to say about this. Oh, very interesting results. 71%, almost 3/4 of our group, wants to continue on course as is, continuing to support Ukraine's military with weapons, but not having direct U.S. troop involvement. We have 12% who think we should be more involved there, 14% who seem to have fallen in line with the letter from the Democratic Progressive Caucus before it was withdrawn. It's 14%. And very, very small numbers saying that we should either reduce funding for Ukraine or end our involvement there altogether. The second topic that I wanted to bring up also, which is not getting the kind of attention that I believe it should in the presidential campaign, is a court case. In the US Supreme Court, next Monday, October 31st, we'll hear a case on college admissions, specifically at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina, but with ramifications for higher education throughout our country. And both of these cases have to do with the degree that an applicant's racial or ethnic heritage ought to be considered in their admission to college or university. Now, for many years now, since the late 1970s, the Supreme Court has ruled that a university cannot base admissions policies solely on an individual's race or ethnicity. But over the years, it has narrowed its definition of how a university can consider these factors. And just 6 years ago, in 2016, the Supreme Court ruled on a case brought at the University of Texas, and they ruled that race could be a contributing factor in college admissions, but it could not be a major or the dominant factor. So now that was 6 years ago. And since 2016, Anthony Kennedy, who authored that decision, has left the court. And of course, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has passed away. And since then, Justices Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett have all joined the court, and all three of them have expressed very strong skepticism about the use of racial considerations in college admissions. Now, when this case was heard back in 2016, Justice Elena Kagan recused herself because she had worked on related matters when she was the Solicitor General for the United States in the Obama administration. The newest justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, has already indicated that she'll recuse herself as well on the Harvard case, but not on the North Carolina decision. And what that means, at least when the justices come to a decision on Harvard's admissions policy, and at least as it relates to racial and ethnic considerations for the applicants, it's entirely possible that Justice Sonia Sotomayor could be the only single vote to keep the current system in place. Now, question for all of you. Katie, if we can put up question number 2. Question number 2, what do you think about this question? Would you support or oppose banning universities from considering a student's race or ethnicity in admissions? And we only have 3 options here, and I hope you'll consider them. 1, I support specific numbers of students admitted by racial category. Number 2, and race should be one of several factors considered, and we didn't give you options on whether it should be a major or minor factor, so that answer might be a bit inflated. Or 3rd and finally, no, race and ethnicity should not be considered when an individual is considered for college or university admissions. And let's see how our responses came on that one, can we, Katie, once they've come up? Oh, very interesting. Only 8%, even for a group that we know from previous experience does lean somewhat leftward, only 8% have said that they would support specific numbers of students admitted by racial category, the traditional definition of affirmative action. 66% say that race should be one of several factors considered, and it would be interesting if we'd had the opportunity to find out whether it should be a major or minor factor, or one or the other. And then third, 26%, a little bit more than 1/4, said that race and ethnicity should not be considered at all. So as it happens, just last week, the Washington Post and George Mason University took a nationwide poll on this very question. And so the Post, George Mason poll, asked the American people the same question that I just put to all of you. And it showed that more than 60% of adults in the United States would support the court banning colleges and universities from considering a student's race when making admissions decisions. More than 60% of Americans said that they would support banning that consideration at all. Now, when these numbers are broken down by the race and ethnicity of those surveyed, the results are even more striking. Not surprisingly, 66%, almost 2/3 of white respondents, said they'd support such a ban. But so did 65% of Asian Pacific voters. And so did 60% of Latino and Latina voters, so that they would support a ban on race-based, on racial considerations as any part of the college admissions process. And of the 4 ethnic categories, only Black voters continue to support the use of racial considerations in college admissions, and only by a fairly slim majority of 53%. Now, it's fair to note, it's important to note that equally large majorities said that they did support efforts to make sure our student populations at our colleges and universities were diverse through various outreach efforts. But very interesting numbers on the broader consideration. And once the court has ruled, we'll almost certainly come back to this issue and talk about it in greater detail. And so I want to thank all of you who signed in tonight for a conversation about the elections, for humoring me for the first 10 minutes or so of this discussion. But as I said previously, elections are important, but elections have consequences. And even issues that aren't being debated on the campaign trail are still worth our consideration, even only 2 weeks before an election. But let's move on to the election. But one of the most important things that's happened just in the last few days on the campaign trail is a very notable shift in the issues under discussion. And in particular, the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates are in the process of making a very considerable shift in the issues they're emphasizing at an unusually late time in the election cycle. Now, for months, and we talked about this at our last program earlier in October, for months, Republican candidates talked as much as they possibly could about the issues of inflation and crime, and to a certain extent, immigration. And Democrats, ever since the Supreme Court's decision on Dobbs back in June, the Democratic candidates and the Democratic Party have been emphasizing abortion policy to a much, much greater degree than any other issue. But just in the last week or so, we started hearing from notable Democrats who were expressing their concern publicly through the news media that the Democrats were spending too much time talking about abortion rights and not enough time talking about economic issues, inflation, and related policy matters. Bernie Sanders, Nancy Pelosi, and plenty of other leading Dems were warning that the party shouldn't ignore economic issues at a time when inflation has returned to the degree that it has. So in the closing days of the campaign, we're seeing the Democratic Party and its candidates shifting messages and not abandoning the abortion issue, but beginning to talk about it much less frequently in order to spend more time talking about economic policy, particularly about inflation. So the challenge for a Democratic candidate is, what do you emphasize? These are both very important issues, of course, and there's several other important issues as well: immigration, climate change, foreign policy, any number of other issues. And it's really easy for those of us sitting in the cheap seats watching to say, well, they should talk about both, or they should talk about all those issues. But at a certain point, there's only so many speeches a candidate can give between now and election day, only so many ads their campaign can run, only so many emails and texts they can send out. So the question, perhaps an unfair one, is which issue should come first? Katie, can we put up our next question for our group? Okay, so first we'll ask about the Democrats. What issue do you think the Democrats should be emphasizing most in the midterms? Should they be talking primarily about the economy and inflation like Sanders and Pelosi have been saying recently? Should they continue to emphasize abortion and other healthcare related issues the way they have been for most of the summer and fall? How about climate change policy? Is that something that you think should be the most important issue for Democratic candidates talking about? And then fourth and fifth, we put up options of foreign policy and immigration policy. Just in the last several days, we've begun hearing from several Latino community-based organizations that they don't think that President Biden has done as much in the area of immigration reform as he had indicated he would when he was running for president. So for all of you who are going to put on the hat of Democratic strategists for just a moment, if you could tell your candidates to talk about one of those issues more than any of the others, which would it be? Wow, looks like Bernie Sanders and Nancy Pelosi have some followers in our group, don't you think? 74%, just about 3/4 of our group, said Democrats should be talking about the economy and inflation more than anything else. Only 20% say abortion and healthcare, and that's notable because for many months, many Democratic strategists believe that that would be the issue that would carry the Democrats to victory in the fall. And when the New York Times Siena poll came out just a week or so ago, showing that only 5% of Americans said that abortion was the most important issue for them, 5%, that clearly began to cause Democrats to rethink. Only 3% would advise Democratic candidates to talk about climate change first and foremost, and only 1% say that either foreign policy or immigration should be their top priority. So right away, we're going to ask you to take off your Democratic strategist hat, and we're going to ask you to put on instead your hat of Republican strategist. Now, we know from previous surveys that we've done that not all of you wouldn't comfortably put on a Republican strategist hat, but we do want to, in the interest of fairness, in the interest of an interesting discussion, have both sides of this conversation. So, Katie, let's put up our fourth question. And here we go. This is similarly straightforward. What issue should Republicans be emphasizing most in the midterms? If you were advising Republican candidates, what would you tell them that they should be talking most about? Should they be talking most about the economy or inflation? Should they be talking most about abortion or healthcare? One issue we've added here for Republicans, because many of them, as we said earlier, are already talking about it, is crime, criminal justice, and public safety issues. And then, like we did for the Democrats, we have immigration and foreign policy as the fourth and fifth issues. So same question now for you as Republican strategists, as we did for a moment ago, when we were asking you to be Democratic campaign advisors. Which of these five issues would you tell a Republican candidate that he or she should spend the most time talking about? Really, really interesting. 80% of you, a little bit more, but similar numbers to what you were telling the Democrats. But it's very clear that our group at least believes that candidates in both parties should spend most of their time talking about the economy and inflation in the last couple of weeks of the campaign. Abortion, a notably smaller number for Republicans than for Democrats for, I think, relatively obvious reasons, only 3%. 14% advise Republican candidates to talk about crime, and 2% are suggesting they talk about immigration and foreign policy. So once again, really interesting numbers, and thank you for taking both sides of this discussion for us. Now, finally, let's turn and talk about the individual races. And don't worry, we're not going to talk about every single campaign. There's 33 campaigns for U.S. Senate taking place and 435 for House, plus campaigns for governor and ballot initiatives, and here in Los Angeles for mayor. So we're not going to try to cover all of them. But let's look at some highlights. Let's think about some highlights. So in the U.S. Senate, where there's a 50-50 tie, as all of you know, and where Vice President Kamala Harris breaks the tie to give the Democrats the narrowest of majorities. Among the 34 seats that are up, excuse me, not 33, but 34 seats that are up this cycle, there are 11 Senate campaigns going on right now in which the margin is within 10 points, one way or the other. Now, of those 11 races that are within a 10-point margin, say those that are worth paying the most attention to are the following. The states of Georgia, the state of Pennsylvania, the state of Nevada, the state of Wisconsin, the state of Ohio, the state of North Carolina, and possibly the states of New Hampshire and Arizona, although it'd be beginning to look like Democrats are enjoying somewhat larger margins in those two states. So that's about half a dozen races around the country: Georgia, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. We can talk about them in more detail, if you like, during the second half of the program, when Rachel will join me on screen and will answer as many of your questions as possible. But it appears that even of those six, there's three in particular that have emerged, and whichever of the two parties wins two of these three Senate races will almost certainly have a majority in the next Senate come January. And those three seats are the state of Georgia, where the incumbent Democrat Raphael Warnock is running against Republican Herschel Walker; the state of Nevada, where incumbent Democrat Catherine Cortez Masto is running against the Republican challenger Adam Laxalt; and in Pennsylvania, where the Democratic Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman is running against Republican Mehmet Oz. At this particular moment, and these races are all too close to predict an outcome with any kind of confidence, but given the controversies that Herschel Walker has been facing in Georgia over the last week or so, Democrats have opened up, Warnock has opened up a small but significant lead there. In Nevada, on the other hand, the incumbent, Catherine Cortez Masto, appears to be in some trouble, where the Republican Laxalt has opened up a small but equally significant advantage. If those two numbers hold, and we don't have any idea if they will or not, we will know if we're lucky in 2 weeks, but it could be sometime after that, that means the control of the United States Senate could come down to the Pennsylvania Senate race, the campaign between John Fetterman and Mehmet Oz. And while Fetterman enjoyed a very large lead early in this campaign, Oz has been steadily making up ground. And depending on the poll, Fetterman has a lead of as much as 5 or 6 points, or as little as just 1 point, or a dead even race. So there's plenty of Senate races for us to watch over the next couple of weeks. But just in case you weren't already, keep a particular eye on the state of Pennsylvania, because that one could be very well could be decisive. Katie, if we can, let's put up our next question for the group that's gathered with us. Because we're going to ask you, as we did earlier this month, same question. We're going to ask, what do you think will be the outcome of next month's Senate elections? Do you think there'll be a large Democratic majority, a small Democratic majority? And we'll define small and large the following way. A small Democratic majority would be 51 or 52 seats. A large Democratic majority would be 53 seats or more. Or do you think it will remain a 50-50 tie with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker? Alternatively, do you think there might be a small Republican majority of 51 or 52 seats? Or do you think it could end up being a larger Republican majority of 53 seats or more? Now, what we're going to do in just a minute is we're going to remind you of the answers that you gave us just a few weeks ago. But before we show you those answers, let's see the new ones. So Katie, have we got those ready yet, or are they still coming in? Look at that. 31% say a 50-50 tie. 41% say a small Democratic majority. Only 1% say a large Democratic majority. 25% say a small Republican majority. Only 2% say a large Republican majority. So how does that compare to last month? Or excuse me, to earlier this month? Just a couple weeks ago, 50% of you, exactly half of you. Katie, can I ask you to put those responses back up again? Is that doable? Oh, great, thank you. Just a few weeks ago, 50% of you predicted a small Democratic majority of 51 or 52 seats. Now that number is down to 41%. Those of you who predicted a small Republican majority is almost unchanged. It was 25%, now it's 24%. So what that means is we've seen almost a 10-point rise in those of you who think it'll be a 50-50 tie. So looks like a move, not a huge move, but a pretty notable move in terms of our own group's public opinion, away from the Democrats and either toward a 50-50 tie or that small Republican majority. My own opinion, not on the outcome, but as the two parties fight seat for seat and state by state, my own opinion is that both parties have unnecessarily harmed themselves in their fight for control of the Senate. Some of the self-inflicted damage came during the primaries. Republicans nominated very strong pro-Trump candidates like Blake Masters in Arizona and Herschel Walker in Georgia, in seats that otherwise looked like likely Republican politics. But by nominating Masters and Walker instead of more mainstream conservatives, those seats are now going to be much more difficult for them to achieve. Democrats in their primaries, though, they were nominating very progressive candidates like John Fetterman, who we've just talked about in Pennsylvania, and Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, two candidates who are under very, very fierce attack, particularly for their records on criminal justice and public safety issues. And we've seen those races tighten considerably when both Barnes and Fetterman ran against more centrist alternatives back in the primaries. And even in the closing days, even in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, when you think both parties would be behind anybody who had the right letter after their name, even now, you see the two parties staying out of potentially winnable races for their candidate because that candidate doesn't necessarily fit the ideological profile of their party. In the state of Ohio, Congressman Tim Ryan is running in a very, very close race against the Republican candidate, J.D. Vance. And the National Democratic Party has put very little money into Ryan's race, no matter how close that campaign is, while they're still putting money into other races where the margins are much, much larger. And Republicans nominated a candidate in Colorado by the name of Joe O'Dea. I would call him more, not necessarily a moderate, but more of a Bush-Romney Republican. He is personally pro-life and supports a 15-week ban on abortion, but does not support, for example, a complete elimination of abortion protections in his state or in the country. And by taking more centrist positions and by publicly distancing himself from Donald Trump, O'Dea is not seeing a great deal of national money either. So when we finally know, whether it's on election night or the next day or the next week, or the next month, when we finally know which party controls the Senate, I'll suggest to you that both parties ought to be looking in the mirror, the losing party ought to be looking in the mirror just a little bit and wondering if maybe they shouldn't have made smarter decisions when it came time to select and to fund their candidates. Last thing I want to cover, and then we are going to bring Rachel on because I really do want to hear your questions. As I've told you many times before, that's my favorite part of the program. But I do want to talk for just a couple of minutes about the House of Representatives. 435 House members. They're all up for re-election, of course, this year as they are every 2 years. And right now, of those 435, there's about 30. In fact, according to the latest analysis by the Cook Political Report, which is considered to be really the gold standard of nonpartisan analysis, the Cook Political Report, in their latest revision just in the last few days, said that there are 31 seats that ought to be considered a toss-up that are just as likely to vote for a Democrat as a Republican. Now, of those 31 seats, though, 23 of those 31 are currently held by Democrats. And because Democrats right now only maintain a very small handful of seats as a majority in the House, they would need to win not every single one of those 31 seats, not every single one of those 23 seats, but the overwhelming majority of them. They'd need to keep almost all of the seats that they currently hold in order to keep a House majority. And while that's certainly not impossible, far from it, history shows that the odds are considerably against them. Now, to dig in a little bit deeper, there are 14 House districts currently represented by Republican candidates that Joe Biden won. There are 9 districts currently represented by Democratic members of the House that Donald Trump won. But what we're seeing in the closing weeks of the campaign is Republicans are now advertising very heavily in districts that Biden won. And the Democrats are beginning to pull out of some of those districts in order to put their funding into candidates who they believe to be endangered. So certainly an impossible task to predict all 435 House seats. But what I will do is I'll offer you just a few to watch on election night. Now we'll be back here on election night from 5 to 6 p.m. Pacific time. And so by the time we're done, we'll just be beginning to start seeing results from around the country. And while there are many House races around the country that are worth keeping an eye on, I'm going to give you just a few from the eastern states, whose states polls close a little bit earlier, where we might have results a little bit earlier in the evening on November 8th that might tell us about how the evening is going to go. 2 of those seats are open seats. One where a Republican retired and the other where a Democrat retired. In North Carolina, in a district that approximates parts of the so-called Research Triangle, the area near Duke and University of North Carolina, there's an open seat in the 13th District of North Carolina between the Democrat Wiley Nickel and the Republican Bo Hines, that when you're watching election night, if you hear one of the announcers mention that race, that's an early indicator on what we might be seeing over the course of the evening. And the other open seat is in the state of Rhode Island, in the 2nd district there, which is largely the city of Providence, where Democrat Seth Magaziner is running against Republican Alan Fung. That's been a fairly safe Democratic district for many years. Fung is running a very close race. While Magaziner is favored, if Fung does win, then you can begin to think about not just whether Republicans will have a majority, but how big it will be. And then finally, I'll offer you the names of a small number of Democratic incumbents running on the East Coast who are facing particularly difficult re-election campaigns. And the names I will share with the names that I'll suggest that you keep an eye on that night are in the state of Maine, Democratic Representative Jared Golden. Jared Golden is one of the most moderate members of the House Democratic Caucus. He's voted against President Biden more than any other Democratic House member. The second would be Democratic incumbent House member Matt Cartwright in the state of Pennsylvania. And then finally, 2 incumbent Democrats in Virginia, Elaine Luria and Abigail Spanberger. All of these states, North Carolina, Maine, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, have early closing times. And so even hours before the polls have closed here in California, long before we start seeing results from other parts of the country. When those results start coming in, that's going to be our first clue as to who controls the House. And so last thing, before I ask Rachel to join me, I'm going to ask Katie to put up our sixth and final question. We asked you to make a prediction on the House races, on the Senate races just a minute ago. Now we want you to make a similar prediction on the House races. And once again, in just a moment, we'll compare this to your predictions from just a couple of weeks ago. So what will be the outcome of next month's House elections? Will we see a large Democratic majority or a small Democratic majority? I don't think we can see a 50-50 split in the House because there's an odd number, but I think you get the point there. Or will we alternatively see a small Republican majority? A single-digit majority, we'll say subjectively, is what we'll call a small Democratic or Republican majority, 10 seats or less. Or do you think it'll be a larger Republican majority? So as those results are being compiled, I'll share with you what we saw, what we got from you just a couple weeks ago. And Katie, whenever you have the numbers ready, by all means, please put them up. Oh, that was quick. So 31% say a small Democratic majority, only 1% say a large Democratic majority, 10% say a 50-50 tie, and I guess we'll have to ask you more about how that's going to happen. 46% say a small Republican majority, and 11% say a large Republican majority. So I will tell you this. Well, 2 weeks ago, your projections for a Republican majority were almost identical to what they are now. For a small Republican majority, were absolutely identical to what they were now. But just 2 weeks ago, 48% of our group predicted a small Democratic majority. And now that number's down to 31%. So much more of a shift in our group's opinion on the House than on the Senate. It's very clear that a lot of people who were picking a Democratic House just 2 weeks ago have changed their mind on that one. Okay, we've covered an awful lot of ground, but we got a great deal of time left. And again, my favorite part of the program is when Rachel comes on and we get to answer your questions. So Rachel, let's get to work.
Hi, Dan. Thank you so much for doing this special session for us tonight. And thank you to the audience for your great questions as usual. So I will go ahead and just jump in. So our first audience member asked, voters are thinking of voting for Republicans because they think Democrats aren't handling the economy right, but Republicans have not talked at all about what they would do. What can either side say specifically about what they will do to fight inflation?
Okay. So Biden and the Democrats, when they talk about inflation, they talk about steps that they've already taken to try to provide economic support for voters in this country through the Relief Act, through the passage of the infrastructure bill, and other legislative steps they've taken. They also warn that Republicans, by cutting government spending, what they would say in an indiscriminate way, will cause real harm to voters. Republicans point back to the spending measures that Congress passed earlier this year and say that in retrospect, Congress spent far too much money than they should have on those relief and infrastructure programs, and that putting that much more money into circulation is what's caused inflation. They believe that cutting back on some of that spending, they also point to President Biden's student loan program, student loan relief program is something they would cut back on because they do believe that putting that much more money into circulation would add to inflation. So a little bit about what they do, a lot more about what they don't like about what the other side is doing and would do. And that's not particularly unique or particularly unusual for the stage of a political campaign. If you dig a little bit deeper, you will actually be, should you care to, you could actually find some more detailed prognosis prescriptions from each of the two parties on what they believe needs to be done to reduce inflation. Republicans will talk in particular about gas prices and additional energy exploration. Democrats will talk about various ways of providing support for those who are having trouble buying food or paying rent. But even though the public emphasis is primarily on accusations, if you are willing to look at the two parties' posted prescriptions, you will find some ideas that for you to consider.
Great. Well, I know you talked a little bit about some specific races that our audience should be watching for. So we've had a few questions come in about those.
Good.
This audience member asked, I would be really interested in hearing your views on the elections in Nevada and in Arizona, particularly regarding the reports of the need for increased security around ballot boxes in the latter state.
Okay. Well, right now, it looks like both Nevada and Arizona, both states have campaigns going on for both governor and for Senate. It's entirely possible we could end up with a split decision in both of those states, where a governor of one party is elected and a senator of the other party is elected. In the state of Nevada, I mentioned that Adam Laxalt, the Republican challenger for Senate, currently enjoys a small advantage at the same time that the Democratic incumbent governor there, Steve Sisolak, has a small lead over his opponent. In Arizona, it's exactly the reverse. The Democratic incumbent senator, Mark Kelly, has a small but growing lead over his challenger, Blake Masters, who we talked about a little bit earlier. But in the governor's race, it appears that the Republican candidate, former television broadcaster Kari Lake, is at least currently enjoying an advantage over her opponent, Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. Both states, Arizona and Nevada, by any objective measure, are purple states. They vote for Democrats in some elections and Republicans in others. What's most interesting as we watch these races head into their final days is Senator Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada is the first Latina ever elected to the United States Senate. But her support among Latino and Latina voters is significantly lower than Democrats would normally need to win in a heavily contested state like Nevada. So in the last couple of weeks of the election, you're going to see Senator Cortez Masto spending an immense amount of time not trying to persuade undecided voters, but trying to motivate Latino voters who aren't all that excited about her, that turning out for her is particularly important. If she's going to catch and pass Laxalt, that's what it's going to require. In Arizona, the governor's race looks to be a bit more in question. Blake Masters in the Senate race has made up some ground on Kelly, but at this point, a lot of the larger national funders of Republican races have pulled out of Arizona. And so if Masters were to win, that looks like it'd be quite the surprise. In the governor's race, even while Arizona has voted Democratic more regularly in recent years, there are two Democratic senators, Kelly and Kyrsten Sinema. And the state, of course, voted for Joe Biden in 2020. But the state does currently have a Republican governor, Doug Ducey. And Kari Lake is running what appears to be a very savvy campaign to replace him. Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State, who's the Democratic nominee in Arizona, is starting to face criticism from her own party. A lot of Democrats willing to be quoted in local and state media talking about how she's not as strong a candidate as they had hoped. And while, again, I'm never going to predict an outcome, generally speaking, when a candidate's own party members are criticizing them in the last couple of weeks of a campaign, that's never a good sign. So these are all very, very close races, but it wouldn't be surprising at all if both states ended up splitting right down the middle.
So shifting to another state that we got a few questions about, this audience member asked, why haven't the Democrats been more active in Iowa? Senator Grassley is 88 years old. Shouldn't that make him vulnerable?
Well, there's a famous saying from the American humorist Mark Twain. He once said that a cat that sits on a hot stove will never sit on a hot stove ever again, but he'll never sit on a cold stove again either. And just 2 years ago, you may remember there was a Senate race in Iowa in which the Republican Joni Ernst was running against the Democratic challenger Teresa Greenfield. And most analysts consider that to be a very close race. And the National Democratic Party put immense amount of money into Greenfield's campaign. But not only did it earn wins, she won by a fairly large margin. And given that Iowa has voted Republican by very large margins in the last in recent presidential campaigns, the fact that they've elected a Republican governor by fairly safe margins, the National Democratic Party, trying to decide where to put its money, decided that even though the incumbent Chuck Grassley is 88 years old, that they did not think he was all that vulnerable. Now, just a week or two ago, Ann Seltzer, the pollster in Iowa, who's considered to be the most accurate polling expert in that state for many, many years now, she had a poll that showed Grassley running only 3 points ahead of his Democratic opponent, who's receiving almost no national financial support at all. That's caused National Democrats to engage in some hand-wringing. But while they see that there may be more of an opportunity in Iowa than they had assumed, they look at some of the states that we were just talking about, looking at states like Pennsylvania, like Georgia, like Nevada, like Wisconsin, and deciding that those are states more deserving of their limited financial resources.
So pivoting a bit, this audience member actually had a question about the polls and your thoughts on the broader issue, but they asked, why didn't you include threats to democracy as a campaign issue?
Okay. Well, one of the challenges we have with our Zoom function, as you know, Rachel, is we're only allowed 5 options on a poll. And it wasn't easy for me to decide on the 5 to pick. But I did choose ultimately to pick 5 alternatives that were all more traditional, tangible policy measures. And that's not to say that I don't think that the threat to democracy is an important consideration. A recent poll came out from NBC showing that 80% of Americans, 79% of Republicans and 81% of Democrats, but 80% of our country thinks that the other party represents a threat to democracy. Because solutions to a challenge like that are less obvious, or at least less tangible than the policy matters we raised, I made the decision to put 5 more traditional policy alternatives before the group. But I certainly didn't intend to suggest that there weren't other important issues to be considered as well. And certainly democracy, of course, is one of them. What I will note before we move on is that both parties seem to have decided, for the most part, that talking about a threat to democracy is not something that they think is going to win them many campaigns, because the amount of time that the candidates are spending, either in speeches or in advertising, talking about the issue is infinitesimal. And in fact, Democrats are spending less than 3% of their advertising dollars on ads talking about Donald Trump. Republicans are spending even less talking about what they consider to be democratic threats to democracy.
Thanks, Dan. So also kind of in a broader vein, this audience member asked, do you think there will be significant challenges to the election results in the 2022 midterms?
There will be challenges to the 2022 results. And my unhappy prediction is that that's a challenge that's going to become greater in future years rather than less. I think more and more candidates have decided that simply refusing to accept the results is a way, maybe not of overturning an election, but much more likely of empowering their base for future campaigns. And so sadly, we're going to see much more of this in the days and weeks after the 2022 election.
So I want to pivot because we got a couple of questions about Ukraine, which you spoke about earlier in the program. So this first question is, since almost all of the support for Ukraine is in the form of US-made armaments, isn't our support really a form of a jobs bill?
Well, I would say that supporting Ukraine has many ramifications, one of which is potential economic and jobs issues in this country. But there tends to be somewhat of a lag period on those. In other words, the weaponry that we are sending to Ukraine now has already been produced and manufactured. And anything that's currently under production, it's going to be some time before they're available for military use in Ukraine or elsewhere. So there certainly are economic considerations, but I haven't seen many politicians of either party talking about Ukraine's support in the context of domestic American economic growth. It appears to me that whether you happen to agree with their position or not, the overwhelming majority of elected office holders, Democratic and Republican alike, those who do support continued military aid for Ukraine, are doing so for geopolitical reasons as opposed to domestic economic reasons.
And in the same vein, we got a question, what do you see as the long-term implications of removing support for Ukraine? They are an agricultural center for world food. Long-term, don't we need to defend Ukraine and keep them as an ally?
Well, as you know, I generally try not to take sides in these things because that's my job in these webinars. But I think the questioner is exactly right. Whether it is Ukraine's role as a food producer, whether it involves the broader balance of power in Europe, and in particular in Eastern Europe, I think there's all sorts of important reasons for the US to continue its role in support of Ukraine. And one of the, it is interesting, although I included foreign policy as one of our 5 issue options on questions 3 and 4, it is worth noting how few American politicians are campaigning for or against aid to Ukraine in this election cycle. Back in February, this was an issue that captivated the American public. Here we are 8 months later, and it's certainly something of which we're aware, but something that's not getting nearly as much public attention as it once did. And as I said earlier in the program today, Vladimir Putin's gamble from the beginning is that Westerners in the US and elsewhere would simply get bored and they would lose interest. They would not appreciate the economic pressures that a prolonged military engagement would cost and would ultimately back off because of that. That's still the gamble that he's taking. It hasn't paid off to date, but I would say, slightly taking sides myself, that when he sees a statement like that from McCarthy, when he sees a letter like that from the Democratic Progressive Caucus, if anything, both of those actions encourage Putin, because it reminds him why he decided to take this gamble to begin with.
So moving back to the elections for the remainder of our program, I think we have time for a couple more questions. So one of our audience members asked, what effect do you think the LA City Council scandal will have on the mayoral election, if any? Do you think it is an issue that can impact the midterms in California more broadly?
Well, really interesting question. For those of you from outside of Los Angeles, our city council here has been roiled by a controversy in which 3 members of our council and a very influential local union leader were caught on audio tape using a great deal of racially tinged and very objectionable language. The city council president has resigned. The other 2 council members are hanging on, but it really has turned our local and regional politics upside down. Does that affect the outcome of the mayor's race? And I don't have a good answer on that, I have to admit. Karen Bass, the former legislator and current member of the House of Representatives, long before she ran for office, founded an organization called Community Coalition, which was founded and to this day still exists in efforts to strengthen relationships between Black and Latino communities. So she is pointing to this controversy as an example of why her type of experience is going to be necessary in bringing Los Angeles back together. Rick Caruso, the successful business owner who's running against Bass for mayor, has been running from the very beginning as an outsider, somebody who wants to turn over City Hall. He says that City Hall and local government is corrupt. We need to turn them out. We need to start over and bring in a new perspective and new ways of doing things. And just as Bass has argued that her experience is the remedy to this controversy roiling Los Angeles right now, Caruso is arguing that his experience coming in as an outsider, that this is the preferred path, that this is just one more example of a city government that's no longer responsive to its people. It's not yet clear which of the 2 is making the better argument. They've both essentially taken this extraordinary controversy and turned it into talking points to reinforce their biographical credentials that they were already discussing. What I would say briefly about the mayor's race, which I think is of great interest, not only to those of you in Los Angeles, but those of you in other parts of the country, is for most of modern political history, it's been widely believed that Republican voters tend to be much more reliable voters. They tend to be much more regular voters, that older, wealthier individuals tend to vote on a more consistent basis, while Democratic voters, or while the Democrats, because they rely on less consistent voters, younger people, voters who aren't as stable yet in their lives, voters who lack the same kind of economic means, are less consistent voters. So for years and years and years now, both parties have believed and act on those beliefs that the more people who turn out, the better it is for the Democrat. The fewer people who turn out, the better it is for the Republican. And in the mayor's race, although Rick Caruso is not a registered Republican, he was for many years, but he re-registered as an independent some years back and as a Democrat earlier this year. What's really interesting in this race is that formula is exactly reversed. Caruso is enjoying a notable amount of support from Latino and Asian Pacific communities, voters who tend to turn out on a less regular basis. Bass, in addition to her strong base of support within the Black community, is also drawing very large majorities from self-described white liberal voters, particularly on the city's west side. And what that means is that Bass's voters tend to be more reliable voters, and Caruso's voters not. So Caruso, in addition to running tens of millions of dollars worth of advertising on Los Angeles television and radio and online, Caruso has invested in a historically expansive and ambitious get out the vote program to get less reliable voters to turn out on his behalf. And so even though in most of the country in recent years, we've thought about Democrats as being the ones who need to turn out the vote in order to win elections, here in Los Angeles, the more moderate to conservative of the two candidates is the one working hard to turn out the vote, where the more progressive Democratic candidate actually benefits from a lower turnout. And as we see nationally, more and more voters without a college education aligning themselves with the Republican Party, and more voters with college degrees aligning themselves with Democrats, it's entirely possible that in the not too distant future, we'll see a reversal of this role in other parts of the country too, where Republicans are the party that try to turn out more voters, and Democrats are the ones who benefit from a lower rate of participation.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dan. And I think that'll be our last question for the evening. So thank you to our
audience. We have
audience.
time for two, but that was a long answer.
I'm sorry, I know.
My fault.
No, thank you so much to everyone for the great questions. And thank you again, Dan, for being here.
Well, thank you, Rachel. As always, you did a great job. And as always, thank you to our audience, our participants, for sending in such interesting and thought-provoking questions. As always, I really enjoyed hearing your thoughts, and hopefully did an adequate job of answering your questions and concerns.
And that was such an informative discussion. The good news is we have 3 more programs coming up with Dan. So let me just run through those really quickly for your calendars. I believe all of these are on our website. On November 3rd, there is an in-person breakfast. This is a monthly program that we just started with Dan, and he will have as his guest Sarah Sandwani, I believe is how she pronounces her name. She's the professor of politics at Pomona College. And then on the 8th, Dan's back with the Dan Schnur political report. And on the 17th, a very special post midterm live stream on the 17th. So be sure to check our website and register for those today. In addition to that, we've been keeping Rachel and Katie pretty busy because we've secured a number of additional live streams that I just want to bring to your attention. Pardon me. Rachel and Katie will be getting these up on the website this week and next. November 1st, we have General David Petraeus. On November 7th, Goli Ameri. On the 12th, Shaking in Our Seats. This is an in-person free event, pardon me, at Caltech. And then we have Fiona Hill coming up on the 15th, and Fred Kemp, the CEO of the Atlantic Council. So keep tuned, stay tuned, and check out our website. And if you can, make a donation so we can continue this great quality programming. Thanks all. Dan, thank you as always.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks, everybody.